Well, hi YouTubers, hi, I'm back with 6 books in isolation, and this is a very kind of delicate book to kind of talk about. I'm recording on the 20th, it's due to be uploaded on the 27th, which is Holocaust Memorial Day. On the 27th of January 1945, it was the day that Auschwitz was liberated, and well, the war wasn't over, by the way, it kind of carried on, but it kind of marked a turning point within the war that Auschwitz was liberated. And this is quite a fascinating book. Now, I'm going to be very honest. I've never read any of Primo Levi's work before, okay? Now, this is quite an interesting subject as well because he was captured. He was an Italian man who were captured trying to flee into Switzerland. Now, they would take the women and they would take the children and the elderly. However, men, and no, it was a little bit like, we will take your weak, we will take your children, but we won't take men, okay? But which is, quite upsetting, but also understandable as well, in as harsh as it is. So countries took they helped who they can. So he was captured and by the Nazis and sent to Auschwitz. Now, what's also very interesting as well, let me read the blurb. This is written with Leonardo de Benedetti, okay? Right, and there is blurbs to these fine gentlemen, and honestly, they live such incredible lives. Honestly, after what they endured, how they kind of lived the best life that they could is just incredible, okay? Right, here's the blurb. Awaiting return home in a Russian-administered holding camp in Katowice, Poland, in 1945, Primo Levi, along with his friend, the Dr. Leonardo de Benedetti, were asked to provide a report on living conditions in Auschwitz for the Russian authorities. Published the following year, it was then forgotten and until now. Okay? Now, what's interesting as well, okay, because Primo Levi, he is known for his work as a scholar. He wrote so many incredible books and stories. What is it? Is This a Man? That's the one. I know of the book. I've never actually read it. I really should. But I've been informed that it is one of the most honest and heartbreaking portrayals of Auschwitz. However, at this point in his life, he wasn't Primo Levi, the writer. He was Primo Levi, the chemist. He was a scientist. And it's very kind of interesting as well because this isn't just one of probably the first books, because this was written in 1945 by a victim of the camp. It was also one of his probably first attempts at writing as well, which from a scholarly point of view makes it very, very interesting. Him and his friend Leonardo kind of wrote it together. Leonardo was more of the, I guess, the more kind of scholarly kind of prose, because being a doctor, he was more used to familiar language, whereas Primo, being a chemist, was more about the medicinal side. And it is kind of like, you can kind of see in a way who wrote what, but it flows beautifully as a book. It has a beautiful narrative flow as they're describing their world. And obviously for the Russians, after they came in and liberated, this was probably one of their first ever reads of what it was like for these millions of people who passed through Auschwitz. Okay, here. It's actually part of the introduction, okay? And I just absolutely love this intro. Every story of survival in Auschwitz is a story of extraordinary circumstances, of hard-fought, infinite simul advantage, an extra sip of watery soup, a matching pair of shoes, an hour out of the cold, with reliance on others, and above all, immense luck. Levi's and De Benedetti's stories are no exception. Even among fellow prisoners, Levi later wrote the Italian Jews, the 174,000 were doomed as frail and naive, all lawyers and graduates doomed in their Russian camp conditions of hard labour, violence and filth. Right. Worse, the Benedetti was by all too rights too old to survive here, even to be here at all, and he was never able to find work as a doctor, one of the relative more comfortable and protected positions within the camp world. Yeah, however, Dr. de Benedetti actually lived for 40 more years after the liberation. So even though he had to fight harder to survive in Auschwitz, he spent 40 years living an accomplished life. So I absolutely love that. I absolutely love, even though you can just imagine these two gentlemen sitting there writing this book, and even though it is a very kind of technical kind of prose, it's about sentiment. You can kind of see the origins of Previ, the author, coming through. This is obviously a kind of day in the life or experiences of Auschwitz, but it's also his first ever work. This is it. This book is his first ever work. And you see his origins coming through. I mean, even the title, I mean, the introduction is actually quite long. It's 27 pages. Okay, the actual title of this, when it was written and given to the Russians, is this: Report on the Sanitary and Medical Organization of the Monowitz Concentration Camp for Jews, Auschwitz, Upper Silesia. Yeah, that's, if you can see that. Yeah. So one thing I absolutely love, because this is probably one of the earliest examples of what you would call Holocaust testimonies. The ones who were liberated, they had so much to process. For some who were in the camps of its early days, which was actually prior to 1939, it kind of evolved into the terrible memorial site that if anyone ever visited, you'd know. So for the people who were there, some for longer than others, but the ones who made it to the end and were able to survive and walk out, or even those who survived the German death marches, when they knew they had lost, what the Germans did were round up many of the Jews or the Romani or the homosexuals, the pink triangle wearers, and they basically got as many as they who could walk, the ones again who left so many behind on the hope that they would just and march them to their deaths. And then when they knew the Red Army was approaching, then they turned around and then killed who they had to kind of get rid of the evidence. Right, well, they didn't get rid of any evidence, and mercifully we know their stories and their testimonies, but as a final act of we failed, we lost this war, we are going to destroy the evidence, and the evidence is a human being. I know. It's also interesting as well, because one thing I think this book does acknowledge is, as this is kind of like a day in the life of our experiences at Auschwitz, it does also in a way acknowledge that no one knew at the time that this camp would be liberated in a year. Of course not. But both these gentlemen got there in 1944 before it was liberated. And it does kind of acknowledge that what has gone before that we haven't seen. But this is kind of like, we know how bad it has been, but this is our reality in that moment. But it does acknowledge what went before. Okay, this bit here. By the month of April, when the cold though less severe had not yet gone, the thick clothing and pullovers would be withdrawn and trousers and jackets replaced by similar articles in cotton, also with broad stripes. Only towards the end of October would the winter garments be distributed again. But this no longer happened in autumn of 1944 because the woolen suits and coats had reached the end of any possibility of reuse. The prisoners had to face the winter of 1944 to 45 dressed in the same thin clothes as during the summer months, with only a small raincoat being given a small minority being given a light gabardine raincoat or pullover. Right. Yes, and having extra clothes, that's actually forbidden. What you were given after you were stripped of your identity and the devil's arithmetic placed on your arm, and if you made it as far as you could, and so many didn't, was a cozy when you had to keep sanitary. You had to try to keep clean, which was impossible in that camp. So, yes, and spare clothes or underwear was strictly forbidden. Right. Okay, so further along, and as I said before, this is just point of experiences, but there's a lot of focus on hygiene as well, because obviously we've both been in the medical field. That is very important, and just a way of, even though it's a very kind of severe, it doesn't waste time with emotion, it's a very academic kind of text, if you will. There's this bits here which kind of just show the desperation, and not just these two gentlemen, but millions endured. And the fact is that places like Tesserin in the Czech Republic, on site they were made to look pretty. They were made to look appealing. They invite the Salvation Army to look at the happy little inmates, and then they sent those inmates off to Auschwitz to be killed. That's an example. Right. Hygiene and sanitary conditions in the camp actually appeared to be at first sight to be good. The paths and avenues that separated the various blocks were well maintained and clean, and as far as the mud of the road surface permitted, and outside the blocks were well painted wood, and the inside had floors gently swept and washed every morning, with the three-story bunks, so-called castles, perfectly lined, and the blankets on the pallets completely flat and smooth. But this was only outward appearance. Reality was very different. In fact, the blocks, which should normally have housed 150 to 170 people, always crammed with no less than 200, and often as many as 250. So these two people had to sleep in almost every bed. Right. Now, I have been to Auschwitz. Now, I have seen the bunkers for myself. And it's absolutely appalling. You can just imagine these poor people. You can walk through the bunkers, and you can actually just imagine all these people crammed in. There actually is one, and it did affect me. It was the bunker for children. Families were separated, and there was a separate bunker for children. And this bunker is actually not too far from one of the gas chambers. That really kind of puts it in perspective. There's Auschwitz and Auschwitz-Birkenau. This was at Auschwitz-Birkenau. So, alright. So, we've already talked about food and hygiene and sanitary conditions. This was, I think, as a writing point of view, very, very kind of cathartic for Primo and Leonardo. This bit here, and I think it's written in a way just to kind of illustrate this bit here. I mean, and this bit here, this is, even though it's technical, you really kind of puts you into that mentality as well. I mean, you're reading this but also envisioning it, which makes you feel terrible. So as thing, it puts you there. As this is a book about emotion, if you will, or not that much, being more of an academic text, okay, as a statement, it's written in a way that you kind of help place yourself within that scene. At this bit here, the prisoners were required to take a shower 2 or 3 times a week. However, these ablations were not sufficient enough to keep clean, as soap was handed out in very precipitous quantities. Okay, only a single 50-gram bar per month. Its quality was extremely poor. It consisted of a rectangular block, very hard, devoid of any fatty material, but instead full of sand. It did not produce lava and disintegrated very easily. So after a couple of showers, it was completely used up. After showering, there was no way of rubbing down one's body or drying it since there were no towels. And on coming out of the bathhouse, one had to run naked. Whatever the time of year, the atmospheric and meteorological conditions of the temperature, as far as anyone's particular block where one's clothes had been left, was obviously the camp was divided into separate sections. Okay, there's blocks. There's someone, okay, like say, I can't remember what a shower was. Block, I say it was a block 1. And then you got someone, okay, who's at block 40. You've got to run naked. Even though it's, now I've been to Poland, Poland does get quite cold. You've got to run through all these blocks naked, having a shower. With your dignity, you don't have any dignity, you're just trying to survive. And that, the way it's written though, you can practically feel the cold weather. So, and it's also interesting as well because I think also, and I think this is more Benedetti's comments now, because obviously because of the field that he's in, is when it comes to things like the surgeries itself, when it comes to being the medicinal side, I see Benedetti writing this statement, and I can see this written as a sense of frustration. This bit here. In the surgical wards, the dressings would be applied in the morning. Assisted dormitory were divided into 3 aisles, and each aisle was treated in turn. It followed that each patient received treatment only every 3rd day. The dressings were secured with paper bandages, which tore and came apart in the course of a few hours, so the wounds were receptacle and were always left exposed. Only rare and exceptional cases would dressings be secured with adhesives of plastic, which were used with the utmost frugality on account of its scarcity. Yeah. So that's an example. That is an example. So it's kind of like two emotions. So two emotions writing this. Actually, it's not a book. This was never ever turned to publication. This was just a report they were asked to write. The Russians essentially said to them, "You were in the camp. Just write down your experience," and it became this. So, and this bit here, I just pulled out. It was basically about the Death March. This bit here, I will read this out, even though I've mentioned it already. Right. The Marist camp was evacuated along with all the others in the region of Auschwitz, and the Germans dragged about 11,000 prisoners along with them. According to information received later from someone who made a miraculous escape, almost all slaughtered by a burst of machine gun fire a few days later, when the soldiers escorting them realised that they were completely surrounded by the Red Army, and so no longer had any way open to retreat. They had already travelled some 70 kilometres on foot, almost all that suffering with no food, so the provisions they received before leaving camp consisted of only a kilogram of bread, 75 grams of margarine, 100 grams of sugar, and 90 grams of sausage, and 45 of sugar. Right. So, yeah, and that was a survivor story. So, this is a very interesting book, because obviously the year it was written was the year Auschwitz was liberated, which as a Holocaust testimony. Now, we are very, very fortunate that so many survived to tell their story, and those who didn't had people to survive to tell their story. So, as an example, this is one probably the earliest examples of a Holocaust testimony. And as for that, this book, even though it is probably only about 50 so pages of testimony, deserves so much respect. And also, as I was reading it, this was obviously before Primo, the author. This was before, okay, he turned his attention to actually writing down his experiences that became his work. And he spoke at schools, and he wrote short stories, and he spoke about his experiences. So what happened to him, what happened to so many would never ever happen again. And we live in hope that will never happen again. And I truly hope it never does. 100 million people died in 6 years of absolute madness, and that should never happen again. Generations were lost, and communities still never really recovered. So even 60 years on, because they lost so much. So, as an example of a Holocaust testimony, albeit unintentionally, this is a must read. And you can kind of see Primo evolving, he's starting to begin his evolution. He doesn't realize at the time who he's going to become. At the time, he's just a chemist who was asked to write something, and him and Leonardo de Benedetti, he created something marvelous. So that's basically it. Please read this book. It is haunting, and even though it's a very difficult read, what Primo and Leonardo can do is kind of still replace you in the scene, and also not waste their words. You feel like you're instantly there. So, The Auschwitz Report by Primo Levi with Leonardo de Benedetti. And 60 Books Now Station sign off. Take care everyone and stay safe.